Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening if you're not in Great Britain. Thank you very much for joining us today. It'll be myself, Jill, and my colleague Tristram Hooley presenting today, and we're going to talk to you about the development of a Student Career Readiness Index, which was part of a wider evaluation that our team was working in.
Okay, shall I pick up there?
Yeah, I can't get the slides to click over. Hang on, what am I doing? There we go.
It's been quite interesting to listen to the last presentation because in a way it's kind of similar to what we've done, isn't it? Really. So well, certainly there's some elements that are in common. So yeah, the article's published in the British Journal of Guidance and Counselling if you're interested in following up on it. So there's quite a lot more detail to the validation and so on that we're going to give today. So I think really what we're going to try and talk about today primarily is why we thought it was necessary to develop this instrument, kind of broadly the principles that we undertook to do it, and then how we think it might be useful. So the background, without going into the kind of deep dark history of careers in England particularly, we've moved from one type of model of careers, delivery of career guidance, to another. So a partnership model where career guidance was primarily delivered outside of the school, to a school-based model alongside a whole bunch of very substantial cuts to funding. So so we've ended up with a model. If we move on to the next slide, we've ended up with a model that looks something like this. So we'll talk you through this in a bit, but we've got what we call the CDI framework, which is a series of learning outcomes that describe what it is that career guidance is trying to achieve or careers education and guidance is trying to achieve in terms of learning. We've got the Gatsby Benchmarks, which Jill will take you through in a bit more detail in a second, which is a framework for delivery. So it says what a school should do very practically. Implementing that, our careers profession is the careers profession with two main types of professional, although the distinctions between them are not always quite as sharp as this. We've got what we call careers leaders, which are usually people from teaching background who have got responsibility for the school's provision, and then careers advisors, who are essentially career counsellors who will see students one-to-one. Now, in fact, those roles often are blurred, sometimes are combined, and so on. But broadly, this is it. And then we have some support coming from outside of the school in the form of the Careers and Enterprise Company, which is a government agency, and that's then organised through a series of sort of essentially local authority relationships into what are called careers hubs. So there's some local infrastructure. So if you put all of that together, that's kind of what the English school careers system looks like. So yeah, if we go on to the next one, I think we're going to talk about Gatsby benchmarks here. So do you want to pick this up, Jill?
Yeah. So after the transference of responsibility for careers provision to schools, there was some work done by the Gatsby Charitable Foundation in 2014, which really looked through a lot of existing evidence and pulled out good practice. And this was very much an international piece of work that Tristram was directly involved in. So the report included an explanation of the research that the team did, what they concluded, and the findings in this report ended up being very clear and very accessible and presented to a whole range of different audiences, including school leaders and policymakers, so that they could take this evidence and move it forward and implement it. So this approach to good career guidance has now become quite influential in England. So back in 2017, it formed part of the government's career strategy, with the Gatsby Good Career Guidance findings being used to underpin what schools and colleges should be doing and delivering in terms of career guidance. The following year, in 2018, the government issued statutory guidance for schools and colleges, which included the fact that schools would have to implement and achieve all 8 benchmarks by 2020. that they would need to publish their career programme on their website, and that they would have to have a named careers leader. So what are these 8 benchmarks? The first one then is a stable careers programme, and this very much should be written down, should be accessible by the staff, by the senior leaders, by the students, by parents, anyone in fact who wants to learn more about what the school does in terms of providing career guidance from age about 11 all the way up to age 18, 19. So that careers programme has to be stable, it has to be written down, it has to be accessible, and it has to be overseen by at least one careers leader. Sometimes that can be 2, sometimes the careers leader might be set at 2 different levels. You might have a strategic careers leader, which will be higher up within the school, and then an operational careers leader who's more involved in the day-to-day delivery. Second benchmark concerns learning from career and labour market information. And that's really about ensuring students can find out what sorts of careers are available. And in terms of labour market information, what jobs are available locally, regionally, nationally, and even perhaps internationally. This might also include the future of work, what future careers might look like. This information can be made accessible in newsletters, within class, via different software programs, and done in presentations by employers or teaching staff. The third benchmark is about addressing the needs of each student, and this really makes sure that different groups of students are targeted for particular kinds of work, which might include young people with special educational needs and disabilities. It might include those students who are at risk of becoming not in education, employment or training. It can also include challenging stereotypes for the sorts of careers that are available to girls versus boys. And so it's really about making sure that every single individual student gets what they need. The fourth benchmark is about linking the curriculum to careers. So this means that every single teacher in the school has to become a teacher of careers, and it is within their remit, within their lesson plans, to draw out aspects of the different curriculum and show how they are used within different jobs. And that can be both knowledge, and it can also include the sorts of skills that you might be learning within a different discipline. Benchmark number 5 revolves around encounters with employers and employees, and might also include encounters with apprentices and entrepreneurs. This is about making sure that young people are able to encounter people from a wide range of different backgrounds, doing a wide range of different jobs in a lot of different sectors and careers. So it's very much about initially broadening their horizons, and then later on allowing them to have encounters with the sorts of employers in industries that they're interested in moving into. Benchmark 6 is experiences of workplaces. Traditionally, this might be work experience, but it can also look like work shadowing, and can be done in individual days or across periods of time, such as a week. Benchmark 7, encounters with further and higher education. So further education tends to be more vocational in England. Higher education is university. And this is to allow students to understand the full range of options which are available to them when they either leave school after the age of 16 or when they leave school after the age of 18. And the final benchmark is personal guidance, and this is about ensuring that every student has the opportunity to talk to a professional careers advisor at least once during their school career. So these benchmarks then, the Gatsby Charitable Foundation decided to implement a pilot with 16 schools and colleges to look at whether they could implement these 8 benchmarks, and if they could, how they went about doing it and what sorts of impact that had. So Gatsby looked for 16 different schools and colleges who were interested in taking part, and they whittled this down to 3 further education colleges, 12 secondary schools, and 1 pupil referral unit. A pupil referral unit is a specialist school where students who have behavioural or other issues are taken out of mainstream education and put into this pupil referral unit. It's usually a temporary measure. So these schools and colleges, they varied in their size, the number of students on roll, their specialty offerings, the makeup of the student population. So for example, in terms of whether the students were disadvantaged, had special educational needs and so forth. And the schools also varied in their Ofsted ratings. Ofsted in England is the Office for Standards in Education, Children's Services and Skills, and they are responsible for inspecting and regulating education settings. So each of these 16 schools and colleges was given a small amount of funding in each of the 2 pilot years to help them implement the different benchmarks. Our team at ICEGS, the International Centre for Guidance Studies, were commissioned to conduct an evaluation of both the pilot and then of the impacts that occurred in those 16 schools and colleges 2 years following the pilot. So that started in 2016 and ran until 2020. Within that evaluation, we used a lot of different kinds of data and a lot of different methods to track what was happening, how it was happening, which factors enabled the processes, which factors acted as barriers or were challenging, and then to identify what changes took place in terms of the students themselves, in terms of how career ready they were, what their attainment was like, and where they went on to.
So we, as part of this, as Jill says, we were using a lot of different types of data. So we were using attainment data and you know, and various things that were available in both through going into the schools, talking to the schools, and drawing stuff from the administrative data. We wanted something that was a kind of an intermediate measure that could be more than just, are you enjoying career guidance or are you enjoying the programs, and deliver some kind of assessment of whether career learning had taken place. And so we sort of built that really to try and figure out whether this Gatsby intervention that Jill's described was actually driving change at the individual level, as well as the organizational level, where it was relatively easy to see that schools were changing their practice around this framework. If we go on to the next one. The process we took for the instrument development, I mean, not unlike what was described in the previous presentation, but we started actually in a slightly different place. But we looked at existing measures. We couldn't really find anything that we were very happy was a measurement of career readiness as such. So we took an existing measure, which was the career self-efficacy decision-making scale, and then essentially butchered it through pushing into it a series of different frameworks that were relevant. So the CDI framework that we talked about, the Gatsby benchmarks, the various other things that were around in the UK and English context at the time. And we then used that to generate a lot of items. And so the idea was that those items were very engaged with the kinds of things that people who were trying to develop careers practice in schools were believed that careers should be trying to achieve. We then sent it out to expert review and got feedback on it, made various amendments. We then went out to young people, did cognitive testing, and then we ran a pilot, used principal axis factoring as a sort of factor analysis to explore what was going on, and then finally a confirmatory factor analysis, much as the previous presentation did. So this was our process. So if we go on to the next slide, and then I think it's over to you to say some of what we got out of this.
Yeah, so we set the Student Career Readiness Index up as an online survey. And at the same point in time, each year of the evaluation, we sent the link to the careers leaders in each of the 16 schools and colleges and asked them to disseminate it to students to complete. So this wasn't a match sample. This was particularly different students taking part each year, although what we did end up with was a small subgroup of students who had completed it twice, once in 2016 and once in 2018. So you can see the number of responses that we were getting each year. So we're fortunate enough to have access to quite a large data set, over 1,000 to 2,000 responses each year. We removed incomplete responses, and that was what we were left with.
Okay. Jill, you had 5 minutes.
Okay, so in order to then evaluate what the impact was, we built a measure which was a straightforward activity measure. Have you done any of these things? And it was very directly related to the Gatsby benchmarks. So we don't really need to talk about that. Essentially, students just answered yes or no. I've done these things, which were the things that the Gatsby benchmarks suggested they should have done. So if we then move on, and we then, through this process that I've described already, we ended up with a 9-item instrument, and I think that's one of its, one of the things that we're pretty pleased about is it's a very parsimonious instrument which measures career readiness, and so it says, I can find out how much people in different jobs earn, I can find information out about jobs, I can choose career, and so I think we felt at the end of it, through this quite detailed review and development process, we ended up with something which had a pretty strong face validity, that it was measuring career readiness, and it also kind of worked through our confirmatory factor analysis and so on, that all of this stuff was hanging together. We used this 5-point scale, but we also gave people the option to say, I don't know, and scored them 0 there. Happy to talk more about that if you want. But if we go on.
So we did all the validation, but actually what we found was that there weren't differences based on gender or ethnicity, although career readiness did increase with age, but you would anticipate that. Our next step then really was to think about if we're going to look to sort of understand whether the interventions and the 8 benchmarks are driving increases in career readiness, we needed to unpick the antecedents of career readiness. So we did some basic regression analyses. And what we ended up finding was that the number of benchmarks that a school had was a strong predictor of career readiness, and the number of activities that a student would recall was also a strong predictor of career readiness, which was great because that was what we hoped we would find. And then, so what you've basically got is the more benchmarks a school has, the more activities a student is likely to engage in, and the greater their career readiness. And we found that when we looked at those kinds of variables, it was about 24% of the variance in career readiness was accounted for. We did some further analyses because we had year group, obviously, being related to career readiness, and we wanted to unpick whether is this a straightforward relationship or is it mediated. And using the Hayes process model, we were able to test this mediation model that you can see on screen now. I won't give you all the details of the output because we are a bit short on time. It's also quite tedious and complicated. But essentially what we found was that the influence of year group on career readiness was actually mediated by the number of activities. So the higher the year group, the greater the number of activities that a young person is likely to have engaged in, and the greater their career readiness as a result. Okay, so Tristram.
So, I mean, the findings then are the measure we built is valid and usable. It's sufficiently sensitive to measure the impact of the kinds of interventions that we were looking at, and the Gatsby, not just Gatsby as a whole, so not just a brilliant careers program versus a terrible one, but actually the gradations within that. The demographics, in the sense of most of the, in terms of ethnicity and gender and so on, don't really shape career readiness too much. We've got some interesting stuff on class as well, which we can talk about more, but not very conclusive. But the interventions definitely do shape the career readiness. So that was a kind of very good finding for us in terms of what we were trying to achieve here. Go on. So one of the things, the outcomes of this, obviously one of the outcomes, the sort of substantive finding is that careers programs that are well thought out and designed with the kind of approach that we find in Gatsby and in other similar sorts of approaches work and drive people's career readiness. We also think we've got a kind of approach to developing instruments, which is perhaps we thought a lot about how to build instruments that were sensitive to the particular contexts and policy environments within which we were testing, and so we've kind of set out that process as well, which I've sort of already basically talked through. So if we go on, I think our big kind of conclusions really is that the Student Career Readiness Index is valid and it's available for people to use if you would like to use it. The Gatsby type interventions in schools drive career readiness, and the contextualized approach to instrument development can produce some quite effective instruments that essentially measure what we're interested in here. So I think that's probably where we finish.